Sometimes the loneliest place in your life is next to someone who says they love you, not because they are cruel, but because something essential still never reaches you. You talk, you text, you share a bed, and somehow your inner world still feels like a room they never fully enter. That kind of loneliness is hard to explain. From the outside, nothing looks obviously broken. There may be no cheating, no screaming, no dramatic collapse, just a quiet ache that keeps showing up when the day gets still. You start wondering if you were too needy. Then you go quiet because asking for more feels embarrassing when you already have someone beside you. So you tell yourself to be grateful. You tell yourself this is what adult love looks like. But your body keeps noticing what your mind tries to smooth over. The pauses feel longer, the warmth feels thinner, and the distance feels strangely familiar. That is what makes this kind of loneliness so confusing. It does not always come from being unloved, but from feeling emotionally unmatched. Sometimes the relationship exists, but the emotional meeting point never fully forms. You are with someone, yet still carrying your feelings alone. And sometimes that loneliness is not only about them. It is also about what happens inside you when closeness starts to matter. Because some people do not just feel lonely when they are alone. They feel most lonely when connection is close enough to want, but never safe enough to relax into. That is a very specific pain. It is the pain of being touched without feeling reached. You can see it in small moments. They say they care, but your nervous system stays unconvinced. They sit next to you on the couch, and you still feel emotionally miles away. They ask if you are okay, and something in you says, "Not really, but I do not know how to say it." Or maybe you do say it, but only halfway. You hint instead of ask, because needing clear reassurance feels too exposed. So you become easier to live with and harder to truly know. You shrink the need before it can be dismissed. This is where relationship loneliness often hides. Not only in obvious neglect, but in repeated moments where your deeper experience never fully lands. You may laugh together and still feel unseen. You may have chemistry and still feel emotionally unfed. You may even be loved by someone sincere. But if the love cannot meet the part of you that longs to feel understood, loneliness grows in the gap. And for some people, that gap becomes strangely normal. They learned early that being close to someone is not the same as being emotionally held. Maybe love in your past was present but unpredictable. Maybe affection existed but attunement came and went. Maybe the people around you responded to your practical needs, but not your emotional reality. You were cared for, yet not deeply read. So now, as an adult, you can end up in relationships where something looks stable on paper, but feels empty in your chest. And it takes a long time to admit that difference matters. Because loneliness inside relationships is rarely loud at first. It often begins as a small, private disappointment you keep excusing. You notice they do not ask the second question. You mention something vulnerable, and the moment passes without anyone really staying there. You get a good morning text, but not a sense of being felt. You get consistency, but not emotional contact. Or the opposite happens. The connection is intense, magnetic, almost addictive, but never steady enough to feel safe. You feel wanted in bursts, then emotionally abandoned in the quiet spaces between them. That kind of inconsistency creates a different loneliness, but a brutal one. Because now you are not only missing closeness, you are also constantly bracing for its disappearance. This is where old patterns start shaping present intimacy. The past does not just live in memory. It lives in what your body expects from love. If closeness once came with confusion, your system may stay alert even with kind people. If love once felt unreliable, calm affection can feel strangely unreal. You might tell yourself, they have done nothing wrong, yet inside, you still cannot settle. That does not always mean your fears are rational. Sometimes your body is detecting subtle emotional absence before your mind can name it. But sometimes it means you are standing in a familiar split. Part of you wants to be chosen, and part of you does not believe being chosen will feel safe. So even in a decent relationship, you can feel profoundly alone. Not because nothing is there, but because you cannot fully arrive to receive it. That is one of the hardest truths about attachment. Loneliness can come from emotional deprivation, but it can also come from emotional self-protection. You may want comfort and resist it in the same breath. You may crave deeper closeness, then go numb when it finally appears. You may miss them terribly, then feel irritated the second they get too close. Not because your feelings are fake, but because intimacy activates conflict inside you. A lot of people think loneliness in relationships means the partner is cold, Sometimes that is true, but not always. Sometimes the relationship is lonely because both people are guarding themselves in different ways. One withdraws to stay in control, and the other overfunctions to keep the bond alive. One gets quiet when things get emotional. The other becomes hyper-aware of every change in tone. Neither one feels truly safe. Both end up feeling alone even while trying to love each other. This is why loneliness inside relationships can be so invisible. The connection may continue, but the mutual openness never fully deepens. The relationship becomes organized around logistics, routines, and surface peace. The deeper emotional current stays under the floorboards. You can hear it in everyday moments. One person says, "I am just tired," and the other hears, "I do not want you." One person needs space after a hard day. The other experiences that space like a quiet rejection. One person says, "Nothing is wrong." The room still fills with tension anyway. That is because people do not respond only to words. They respond to emotional pattern, timing, energy, and history. If you grew up needing to read subtle shifts to stay connected, you do not stop doing that in adult love. You become fluent in tiny absences. You notice the late reply, the flatter voice, the missing warmth in their eyes. And even if you say nothing, your body has already started protecting. Maybe you become extra agreeable. Maybe you act like you need less. Maybe you pull away first, so you do not have to feel them pulling away later. Maybe you become colder right after opening up, because exposure leaves you ashamed. That pattern confuses a lot of relationships. The very moment you want to be met is often the moment you become hardest to reach. You may finally admit you were hurt. Then the instant they move closer, you minimize everything. You say it is fine. You say you are just overthinking. But what is really happening is more delicate than that. A part of you learned that once your need becomes visible, your safety depends on shutting it back down. So loneliness grows in a painful loop. You long to be understood, but the fear of needing understanding keeps interrupting the moment. This is also why some people feel lonelier after closeness than before it. Intimacy briefly wakes up hope, and hope makes distance hurt more. When you have been self-contained for a long time, wanting someone changes the stakes. Suddenly their attention matters, and that can feel destabilizing. You may feel more anxious after a beautiful weekend together, not because it was bad, but because it made the possibility of loss feel real. Then the mind starts working overtime. Were they less warm this morning, or am I imagining it? Did I say too much last night? Did I make myself too easy to leave? That is not simple insecurity. It is emotional math shaped by earlier disappointment. Some people were taught, without anyone saying it directly, that closeness is temporary, so every good moment carries a shadow. Others learned that love is available, but only if they stay pleasing, useful, calm, or undemanding. So they become lonely while performing stability. They look low maintenance on the outside. Inside, they are carrying unspoken hunger everywhere. That hunger does not always sound dramatic. Often it sounds like, "I wish you would notice without me having to ask." Or, "I wish you would stay curious when I go quiet." Or, "I wish your kindness felt personal instead of general." This is why people can feel deeply lonely even with nice partners. Niceness is not the same as emotional intimacy. A person can be loyal, responsible, and good-hearted, yet still not know how to meet your inner world. And if your history already made you guarded, that mismatch cuts deeper. Because what you need is not just presence. You need resonance. You need to feel that your sadness changes the room a little. You need to feel that your tenderness does not disappear into someone else's discomfort. When that does not happen, strange compensations begin. You might stop bringing up what hurts and start over-focusing on what is practical. You talk about schedules, groceries, work stress, and travel plans. Meanwhile, the real loneliness keeps sitting quietly at the table. Or you become the emotionally perceptive one in the relationship. You understand them deeply while they mostly understand your moods as problems to solve. That imbalance can make you feel guilty for wanting more. You start wondering if emotional depth is just your thing, instead of a real relational need. But being emotionally known is not some impossible standard. It is one of the ways love becomes nourishing instead of merely functional. Still, there is another hard truth here. Some people feel lonely in relationships because they keep choosing emotional distance that matches old beliefs. They are drawn to people who feel familiar in the wrong way, warm enough to activate longing, unavailable enough to keep full safety out of reach. That does not happen because they like pain. It happens because uncertainty can feel more believable than steady care. A predictable person may look boring at first. An emotionally inconsistent one may feel more alive, because your system mistakes intensity for meaning. So you bond around anticipation, reading signals, and surviving emotional weather. Then you wonder why you feel empty inside something that looks passionate. Passion can hide loneliness for a while. It cannot erase emotional starvation. And some relationships are lonely in an even quieter way. Nobody is especially cruel, but nobody is especially brave either. Both people avoid the deeper conversation. Both keep the peace by avoiding the truth. So years can pass inside a relationship where no one is fully known. There is companionship, but not much emotional risk. And without emotional risk, intimacy stays shallow. Without intimacy, loneliness finds a permanent seat. This is why being lonely in love can feel more disorienting than being single. When you are single, the absence makes sense. When you are committed and still feel alone, the pain gets tangled with self-doubt. You start blaming your sensitivity instead of listening to it. But sensitivity is not always the problem. Sometimes it is the instrument telling you where connection stops. That does not mean every lonely feeling is proof the relationship is wrong. It means the feeling deserves respect, not immediate dismissal. Maybe the relationship truly lacks depth. Maybe you're protecting yourself so hard that depth cannot register. Maybe both are true at once. That is often the most honest answer. You can be with someone who loves you imperfectly while also struggling to receive imperfect love. You can be emotionally neglected and emotionally defended in the same relationship. That complexity matters. It keeps you from turning this into blame when it is really about pattern. Because if you only blame them, you miss your own withdrawal. If you only blame yourself, you've excused emotional absence that is genuinely painful. Maturity starts when you can hold both. I have real needs, and I have real defenses. That sentence changes everything. It turns loneliness from a vague ache into something you can actually understand. Then you begin noticing the moments that create it. The way you laugh something off when you wanted comfort. The way they offer solutions when you wanted presence. The way you say, never mind, when the conversation finally reaches the important part. You start seeing how loneliness is built, not in one giant wound, but in small repeated misses. And once you see that, you can stop romanticizing your self-protection. Distance may feel dignified, but it rarely gives you what you ache for. Staying silent can protect you from disappointment. It also protects the loneliness from being challenged. Acting detached can spare you from feeling foolish. It can also make loving you feel impossible for someone who actually wants to try. That does not mean forcing vulnerability with unsafe people. It means learning the difference between danger and discomfort. Those are not the same thing. A lot of guarded people have spent years treating them like they are identical. Discomfort says, this matters and I can be hurt. Danger says, this is harmful and I need protection. If you confuse the two, every honest moment feels like something to escape. Then loneliness becomes your most familiar form of control. And if your partner is the guarded one, this is worth understanding too. Their distance may not mean they feel nothing. Sometimes it means they feel too much without trusting what closeness will cost. Sometimes the coldness is just panic with good posture. That does not make the impact smaller. It just makes the pattern clearer. Protection can look like indifference. Longing can hide behind delayed replies, changed subjects, or sudden fatigue. A person may miss you all day and still avoid calling. They may need reassurance and resent themselves for wanting it. They may deeply want to lean in, then become sharp or remote right after a tender moment. Not because the tenderness was false, but because it stirred something uncontained. This is where compassion matters, but honesty matters too. Understanding the pattern should not become an excuse to live starved forever. Loneliness is not automatically proof that love is absent, but chronic loneliness is a sign that something important is not being lived. Maybe the relationship needs more truth. Maybe you do. Maybe someone needs to stop translating their needs into hints. Maybe someone needs to stop calling emotional avoidance independence. Maybe the next step is not dramatic. Maybe it is simply becoming more accurate. More accurate about what you feel when the room goes emotionally flat. More accurate about how often you silence yourself to avoid seeming difficult. More accurate about the kind of closeness that actually nourishes you. More accurate about the ways you disappear when it gets real. Because people who feel lonely inside relationships are often not weak. They are often people who adapted early, read rooms quickly, and learned to survive without much emotional help. They became observant, capable, self-controlled, and hard to truly comfort. Their loneliness is not childish. It is intelligent protection that outlived its original purpose. And that is why it hurts so much. You built the self that can function almost anywhere, but not always one that can fully rest in love. So the ache keeps returning, not because you are broken, but because some part of you is still waiting for connection to feel safe enough to enter. Sometimes that means choosing relationships where emotional depth is possible. Sometimes it means staying present long enough to stop abandoning yourself inside them. Usually it means both. Better connections matter, and better honesty inside connection matters too. The goal is not to become someone who never feels lonely. The goal is to stop confusing emotional absence with normal closeness, to stop calling distance maturity, to stop calling self-erasure love, and maybe most of all, to recognize this. Feeling lonely in a relationship does not make you ungrateful, dramatic, or impossible to satisfy. It may mean your heart is noticing the difference between being near someone and being deeply met. That difference is not small. It is the difference between performing connection and living inside it, between being accompanied and being known. So if this loneliness has been hard to explain, maybe that is because it lives in subtleties, in pauses, in misattunement, in all the places where you keep reaching softly and finding no real landing place. But now it has a shape. Now it has language. And sometimes that is the first real shift. When the pain stops feeling like a personal flaw and starts revealing itself as an unmet emotional truth. Because the loneliest people in relationships are often not the ones who feel the least. They are often the ones who feel deeply, notice everything, and have learned to hide their need before anyone else can mishandle it. They can look calm while quietly starving. They can look committed while feeling emotionally homeless. If that is you, your loneliness is not something to mock or minimize. It is information. It is telling you that love does not only need contact, it needs contact that reaches you. And until it does, some part of you will keep feeling alone, even with a hand in yours. Because the opposite of loneliness is not just company. It is emotional safety. It is being real and still feeling held.